maybe I'll go first. So I think our idea tonight is I was going to give my approach to walking, how I got into walking, not from like the toddler stage, but like the kind of more directed walking or undirected walking or useless walking that I try to do now. And then kind of show some comparisons with Berlin, because I was just there walking around for 5 days, and it's a city I rapidly fell in love with the first time I went there, and could go back and back. And I hope it doesn't sound like a oh, we don't have this in Toronto, which is very easy to do when you go to other cities, when you see their nice sidewalks and their nice mayors. But there's that's inevitable. But just to kind of connect the two cities, because I do think Toronto's a really wonderful city to walk around in, and that's how I discovered it. And then Kisha will give her approach to walking and talk a bit about that, and then we might ask each other a couple questions, and then hopefully open it up to the audience with your questions and your experiences of walking, because we all have different ways of moving through the city and exploring the city and talking about some of the joys of it and also some of the obstacles that we face, because we all don't get it. Walking through the city is not an equal endeavor, unfortunately. It should be, but it's not. So I have some slides which I will show. There. Okay. Is that you? No, that's not me.
Okay.
But a friend of mine, Marlene Zuber, who is a Swiss artist but living in Toronto, but she's from Etobicoke. Her dad is from Switzerland. Never mind. I'm trying to make a weird, convoluted connection to the Goethe-Institut in Germany, and I didn't even make it to Germany. Anyway, she illustrated one of my columns in Spacing magazine with this. So it was like walking through the literature of Toronto, kind of reading the city. But since we're talking about Flaneur, and this is a bit of a launch for Flaneur magazine, that it's kind of neat to see this word that's just this ephemeral, silly art word in such a big physical form. But the idea of a Flaneur has kind of been around since probably the mid-19th century, the 1850s, 60s. One of the earliest Flaneurs was Baudelaire, the poet from France, Paris. And he was a bit of a dandy. He walked around, I think, thinking about his trust fund, because how else do you walk around and write poems? Some of us walk around and then go to our jobs. But he kind of pounced around Paris, looking at people, looking at the crowd, observing it, and then going back and writing about it, and using these kind of drifts through the city as a way to a sort of participant observer thing. So he wasn't completely part of the crowd, but he wasn't totally removed from it. So he had some sort of critical distance from it, yet close enough to overhear everything. So the Flâneur gets to wander through the city and be a part of it, but always sort of be conscious of going through the city. So you're always paying attention to the city, you're paying attention to people. If you people watch, which we all do because it's fun, you are engaging in a kind of Flaneur activity, because you are surreptitiously watching other people. They could be watching you, or you could be part of a crowd that other people are watching, but you are the observer. And one of the definitions of Flaneur, it's one of those words, great French words, like great German words, that have kind of these wonderful definitions that apply to different things. And one is, it's the passionate observer, yet sort of detached. Sometimes the Flaneur is criticized for being aloof, or not totally getting involved in everything, but that's the sort of price of being having a bit of a critical distance. So that is a bit of the approach that I have. The other approach I have is connected to this idea of psychogeography, which is another thing that came from Paris. And this from the 1950s and 60s. There was a group of largely radical Marxists in Paris who were upset with the state, the French state, and de Gaulle. And they thought everyone was sort of a cog of the state, and they were just going through their bourgeoisie lives. And they became known as the situationists. So they were sort of a radical, Marxist-y kind of protest group. A lot of their writing and influence was seen in the May '68 student uprising in Paris. And so they wrote endless manifestos. Some of them committed suicide in the '70s when they realized that utopia would never happen. But they did some fun things too, despite the suicide. They would go around Paris and use a map of London. So they would intentionally try to get lost. They would try to break out of their path, their everyday paths. And they would maybe sometimes go on smell walks, and Paris has a lot of smells. Sometimes there's a baguette smell, or there's a sewer smell. There's a lot of sewer smells in Paris. And they would follow that to its source. And they also did this other thing, which was very Flaneur-like. They would go on drifts, or what they call derives, the psychogeographers. So they would just drift through the city and find stuff. Whatever street corner they were on, if left or right, or straight, whatever looked good, they would go on, they would kind of follow that down. And that's a bit of psychogeography, the kind of whimsy, a little less, not so much the Marxist anger stuff, but the whimsy is the part that I found really compelling of how to explore the city. So when I moved to Toronto, I moved from Windsor, Ontario in the year 2000, and it was a very car-oriented, it is still a car-oriented city. All the three automakers were there. There's only 2 left now. I think I was in a car probably every day of my life. The day I turned 16, I went to the MTO and got my beginner's license, because that's what you do. I was very surprised when I moved to Toronto, and there were other people who did not have a driver's license. So I moved to Toronto, and I did not have a car. I left the thing died in Windsor, and so I moved to Toronto after grad school, and started walking around the city, and immediately found it extremely liberating to kind of be just me and perhaps a bag walking around, whereas I was so used to always having this huge thing with me that I had to deal with, which is not that hard of a thing to deal with in Windsor, because you could park it somewhere, but there's a little more parking there. But just losing that half-ton or whatever it is of steel and aluminum and wiring just felt really light. So those first 6 months of walking around Toronto, and then taking the TTC and streetcars and everything, it wasn't as crisis pointy as it is now. So it was a little more efficient at the time. It was just, it shocked me, because I used to walk in Windsor, I'd park and walk around. But the amount of area I could cover and amount of discovery I found was a big revelation. There's this funny moment where I kind of was embarrassed because my first apartment in Toronto was at Yonge and St. Clair, and some friends lived in the annex on Huron, just south of DuPont. And they had a computer. I did not have a computer at the time, so I'd go there to look for a job. And stay there till just before the subway finishes. I'd run up to the DuPont subway station, take it up to St. Clair streetcar, and then over to Yonge, and get home. But one day it was raining, and I didn't get to the streetcar in time, so it stopped raining, and so at around 1:45, I had to walk home. And I was like, this is like a thing, I have to walk home, and I was used to going on that route. And so I walked up to DuPont, and then underneath the tracks, and up Poplar Plains, and all of a sudden I was on St. Clair, and there's Yonge Street. And I was, the way I thought of distance changed on that walk that night. Because if you travel in a car, or even if you travel in transit, and a little bit on bike, because it's a little faster, but cars in transit, not warp, but have a very particular way of communicating distance to you. And it really surprised me how close those two places were. So that was one of those like light bulb moments of like walking is, Toronto is more compact than it is, and walking can get you places. And then I on Sundays, once I got a job, I would use Sunday instead of going to brunch, which is the book that I just mentioned, horrible, wasteful brunch. I would just go on these long drifts for 5 or 6 hours through the city, starting from wherever, take a subway somewhere, and just kind of drift to somewhere. And I heard a bit about the psychogeographers and the situationists, and heard a bit about this Flaneur character, probably from undergrad English class and Baudelaire, or French class, whatever. But the theories weren't exactly like propelling me along. I kind of started doing it on my own because I really was into Toronto. I wanted to find, discover Toronto, and then as I was doing it, the theory kind of it was like, oh, other people did this. This is great, and then kind of use some of that to be a little more directed. I've been to Toronto many times, as many Canadians have. You know, this is the big show. But once I moved here, I realized the parts of Toronto I knew were very limited. It was, you know, Yonge Street and walking up Yonge Street, because that's what you do when you come here, or going to Spadina or Queen West, the immediate Queen West, then to go look at record and tape stores and bookstores, things we didn't have in abundance in Windsor, and maybe hanging around the Annex, because some friends who went to U of T lived there, and when I'd come up, I'd stay in the Annex. I knew the Future Bakery, and I knew Brunswick Avenue. But when I got here, it made me really nervous that I didn't know, you know, where the curve of College Street went, or what was one street over. My mental map of the city had all these kind of Turk spots on it, and that's why I started walking to kind of fill those in, which you can't get if you're in the subway, and you can get a limited amount of map filling in if you're on the streetcar. And that kind of progressed into writing and eventually writing a book about Toronto based on walking. And it was these early walks that really kind of propelled them along. So I kind of re-fell in love with Toronto. It was a city I was always obsessed with because it was the city that had the CN Tower and subways and the Science Center, all this kind of ultra-mod spaceship kind of architecture. As well as it was the place where so much Canadian culture came from. But the walking really made me kind of feel and understand. And now 14 years later, I still write about the city and I still walk the city. Toronto is big enough, because I like to think of it from the Rouge River to Etobicoke Creek, and really even beyond. You should think about, you know, the 416 and the 905 as being the same place as a region. So there's an incredible amount of territory to discover in this city, and I'm still surprised at how I can be surprised with discovering something in Scarborough or North York or in Richmond Hill, magical places or ugly places, whatever they are. The city keeps giving. It is a big place. So it is, when I meet people who say they're bored with Toronto, I don't get it. I think that's about them, not Toronto. Toronto has a lot of potential. And maybe with that, I'll just switch to showing, maybe quickly going through a few slides. It'll be a little bit like this is the vacation I took last weekend to Berlin. And then, as I say, nice things about Toronto, maybe I'm going to say not nice things about Toronto now. Just the experience of walking in Berlin, and maybe kind of bounce those two things, and then I'll be done. So when you walk in Berlin, you realize how big the sidewalks are. Toronto is a bit of an accidental city. It was never supposed to be a great place. Montreal was our great city. And when you go to Montreal, it kind of has this feel of grandiosity, of capitalness, of pride, of investment in infrastructure, despite the crumbling and all that, and the falling down of bridges and the corruption. But never mind that. When you're there, it's about the feeling and the look of the place and wide sidewalks. And Berlin is a city that knew it was a capital from long before Toronto stumbled into being a world city or being this kind of interesting place that it is. So all this space on the sidewalk is a little weird at first as a Torontonian. There's very few streets in Toronto where we get this amount of space. Spadina is one of them. University is one of them, but it's not so much a walking street. University is almost like one of those, it's a parade street, you know. It's like if there was a dictator, if the Fords had a dictatorship, they would march the Ford Nation Escalade tanks up and down University. Yeah. It's that kind of thing. Or you know, Terry Fox ran down University, so there's good parts too. And Spadina, because he was this group, you know, I think it was the Austins or the Baldwins, one or the other, who had Spadina House on top of the hill by Casa Loma. Spadina was their driveway, the driveway that went all the way to the lake, and so they cleared a thing through the forest really wide so they could see the lake from their perch. And because of that rather ostentatious decision, we have a nice fat road, which has room for LRTs in the middle, or streetcars, and fat sidewalks, fat European Berlin-style sidewalks. Mostly we're kind of cramped here. Even Yonge Street, if there's a couple, you know, holding hands, horrible people holding hands. Just one of the first things you can do on a sidewalk is just gets in the way. When you are one human by yourself, You're very agile and you can bounce. But when there are two people, you just become clunky. These clunky blobs of love, going and desperation, going down the sidewalk, which you have to negotiate around.
It's worse if they walk slowly too.
And they always walk slowly because
Yeah.
they're talking, sharing moments and stuff. So here's a Berlin guy not holding hands, and he's an efficient walker walking down this wide sidewalk, and there's ample room to get around him, even if he did fall in love with somebody and want to hold his hand. This is one wonderful thing about Berlin. Another thing about Berlin, that there's way more whimsy in the city than Toronto. Toronto's getting there, but we still deal with Toronto the good, where you have to ask permission to do things, and the answer is no usually. And if there is, you have to get a permit to find out that you can't do something. And in Berlin, there's a looseness and a sense of unexpectedness that Toronto has hints of, and I think has the potential, if we could lose some of this bureaucratic heaviness, or Toronto the good heaviness that we have. So you come across buildings like this that just have these murals that are different than the usual kind of graffiti-based murals, and it's just like a nondescript apartment building, and then you get this wonderful lavender. Who paints things lavender? And this is in Kreuzberg. The funny thing about walking in Berlin, I've been on some organized tours of Berlin, but I've often been by myself, and that's how I really discovered the place. So, and I don't speak German, so my idea of Berlin has the worst pronunciations of U-Bahn stops and street names, which makes it impossible when I try and tell somebody where I was, like a Berliner or a German, and they say, oh no, I was at this subway, this is where I got out, and I start saying it in my way, which makes sense, connecting to that spot, and they're like, this is not in Berlin, and I point to the map, and they give me the complete different pronunciation. So I'm not going to try to pronounce too much here, but when you just kind of read things and you haven't heard them, that kind of name just sticks, and I can't get my own terrible Berlin place names out of my head. This is just down the street. This is along the canal, that kind of canal that runs in the bottom of Kreuzberg. This would be very illegal in Toronto. There'd be many reasons why you couldn't do this. But it's weird, and there's just so much of this kind of thing. The other thing about the climate is a little bit less harsh in Berlin, so you get these wonderful balconies that have green stuff kind of hanging over that would die pretty quickly in Toronto, which is not our fault, or the government's fault, or the board's fault. But they also have like this kind of ability to be a little more colorful. This is like 4 or 5 blocks south of Checkpoint Road, so in West Berlin, a concrete 1960s or 70s building. But there's a lot more color in the place. In Toronto, we're loosening up a bit in that sense. As I sit as a Technicolor green engineer, I have all the primary...
See, I'm the old Toronto, clearly, so we're the new Toronto.
Yeah, so we have the palette, the primary color palette here. Anyway, they tend to use these things more around Berlin. So you just walk around. It's not the kind of gray, blue, glass, gray that we have in this city. And Berlin is often an overcast, kind of misty. It's not known for being an abundantly sunny city. It's not Barcelona. It's a little towards London in that kind of like grayness. Yet they let their buildings have a little more freedom of palette. This is really good. This is about kind of any European city, especially London. They're really good about making these shops with triangular sandwiches. Pret a Manger is a chain in London, and Berlin has a few chains. And it's very good for being a walker, because you don't want to waste time sitting in a restaurant, just like brunch. You want the triangular sandwiches are these great on-the-go things, because they're very portable, and you can kind of shove them in your mouth as a wedge. It's fuel to keep moving. So this is a little diversion of food. This is the only food pick I'll show. But I wish we had more of these in Toronto. Our to-go food is a little messier here. It's not the efficiency of a sandwich. The great thing about Berlin, you walk around and find these kind of euphoric sights, like those buildings, and then you go a few more steps and you find the deepest tragedy and civic trauma. So it's a city that emotionally, walking through is the most kind of fraught and uplifting place, block by block. And the thing, and being fraught and joy can happen, you know, by the address in this place. So you hit the wall throughout the city. And it's kind of this really interesting thing in Berlin to be able to walk between. It's been 25 years since reunification, but the feeling is still there. The look of the city is still there, of east and west. And I liked my Berlin walks to kind of go back and forth between the two. Another thing, you know, I was walking along the Goethe-Institut, and you know, it's like these beautiful buildings, a huge construction site, because they're doing, I think, a big kind of cross-rail thing, which makes us in Toronto dream, but another big rail project there. And then you come across this hole in a square, I think by the university, which is a glass. It's lit up and it has a plexiglass top, and you can stand on it. And it is a room underground with empty shelves. And this is the site where the Nazis burned books. You know, so you're walking along, you know, admiring kind of the beauty of Berlin, and then boom, you kind of drop down the elevator shaft to this kind of terrible moment. And Berlin just brings you up and throws you down, brings you up as you walk around the city. This is just a few blocks away from Checkpoint Charlie. This is one of the first very public killings by the GDR, the communist regime, when this young kid, Peter Fetcher, I think his name was, I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, tried to run from East Germany, climb over the wall, but he was shot, and he lay dying in the view of people on the west watching him die. And there's this memorial in the middle of the street where the wall was, a circle, so you hit this as you're walking home from a bar. But then the bar I was at earlier was completely covered with glitter. The sidewalks were, and this is in East Berlin, it's like the glitter was embedded into the sidewalk. Like I tried to like kick it around, but it was there. So you have these highs and lows kind of in the concrete of the city, which is amazing. It's stunning to a Torontonian. And often because we don't have as many markers in the city, yet we do have civic traumas. You know, this was First Nations land. People were pushed out. There's scenes of oppression and all sorts of things in the city, but we don't mark it in the same way. And when you go to Berlin, it's like we should talk about this stuff a lot more openly. You've never been to a city or a country, but a city especially, that is more open about its traumas and just like lets it rip. And like, look how excruciatingly slow it is for the Canadian government to acknowledge residential schools and all that sort of thing in the past, whereas Berlin just kind of lets it up, and so the conversation is there as you walk, and you have to think about it. And then there's this looseness on the other side of Berlin where people just kind of hang out everywhere, which they do in a few places in Toronto, but everywhere. You know, this is the Reichstag. This is the house that is holding together Europe. You know, it's the most important parliament in Europe, and yet people can hang out and drink beers on the lawn, on Angela Merkel's lawn. Which is kind of amazing. In Toronto, you'd be arrested. I got a ticket last year for $140 for having an open white wine on Hamlin's Point Beach in October. Yes, because the cops ambled along and they saw our open bottle of white, and it was from Niagara region, and you could see Niagara region across the lake, but we got a ticket for it. So anyway, I don't want to rag on Toronto too much. They have Henry Moore. This is just at the top of the Tiergarten. In the middle is another kind of Toronto connection. The kind of this reminded me a little bit of Toronto, but then not. Because this was the big soccer game 2 Saturdays ago between Munich and who was the other team? Dortmund. Yes, and
Unfortunately, the wrong club won.
okay.
Yes.
I was never sure which side to go, so I just kind of quietly, like I didn't know. But there were thousands of people in the street, and this is near Zoo Station in the Kapuska so this is in West Berlin, and that's the great brutalist kind of what's his name? Kaiser Wilhelm Church, yes, and which is kind of bombed out a bit, but has the great 70s brutalism there. But thousands of people in the street. So just like Toronto, when there's a soccer win or a football win, people just, or a hockey win, but that doesn't really happen. People flood the street en masse, but they all have beers. Big beers and a bag of big beers behind them. So the celebration, as much as great as it is in Toronto, in Berlin, I found it was kind of like peaking, and maybe it was a little too much. But maybe the looseness of it allowed. I think I was approaching it as a Torontonian, thinking, this is weird. Like shouldn't be. I wanted a bylaw officer to and tell people they couldn't leave all their Jägermeister little bottles on the sidewalk, and there are thousands of these on the sidewalk. But I think it's funny to be a Torontonian. You're so used to the rules that you can do and you can't do that, and then you come to a place like this and you see people breaking the Toronto rules, and it's like no one's uptight about it. It made a mess. Then the street cleaners came in. The riot police were all there, but on the sideline waiting in case someone did do something. But it's funny to be tense about something and be the only tense person among thousands of people in a crowd. Parks are really well done in Berlin. This is in Mobiet, I think, just so north of the Tiergarten, in Old West Berlin. If you were a kid in Berlin, just these little pocket parks are amazing, and the variety of surfaces in Berlin. Like we tend to pave everything here, or we have crushed stone. Berlin has dozens of different kinds of surfaces on the ground, which, if you are in any way like riding a bike or on wheels, and it causes some trouble. So there is something to be said about our uniform sidewalks, but it does create this kind of beauty, and the kids, I think, have it better in Berlin. Also, a lot of these things would be illegal, and a local parents group would sue the city for having such a dangerous thing. Really nice side. This is in Bedding. Big fat sidewalks, nice subway entrances. Everywhere you go, the kind of quality of the of buildings, despite Berlin's history of being bombed out and over and over, the way they build things, the kind of attention to details and signage and fonts, is kind of amazing. One thing that you have to get used to in Berlin is these the bike lanes, because the striped sidewalks are so wide, are right in the middle of the sidewalk, which as a Torontonian, you just kind of walk through it. The sidewalk is your territory. The bikes are supposed to be over here, where they're supposed to be nowhere, depending on how you're looking at it. And at first I was against it, but then I realized that you get used to seeing these subtle differences in tiles, and that's the bike lane, and that's so you kind of unconsciously stay away from that. And the other thing is the cyclists are not as aggro as they are here. It's very, I rode here and I ride in Toronto, and it isn't. If you're not aggro, you will be aggro by the time you're done riding. Just saying about the city, or the collision of we're not used to bikes, and it's still a car town. Whereas Berlin, riding, and German drivers are much better than Canadian drivers. I think the testing is better, so people know their cars. But there's just more respect. And I rode a bike for 3 days in Berlin, and it's just a world of difference than Toronto. And so when people are walking in the street, a cyclist is not really ringing their bell, like, get out of my way, as I do here. They're just kind of a ting of the bell, and then people kind of like get out of the way. And they move a little bit slower than we do here. So maybe 5 or 6 or 7 more slides, I think. Even between the trams, they kind of grow some grass. I don't think we grow grass in between, because number one, we would salt it to death. And two, we want the fire trucks to be able to go down. The fire trucks still make it to places in Berlin with the grass. But here we have over-regulations, and we wouldn't allow that, because just in case we need the fire trucks to be able to use that. And then within the city of Berlin, there's an amazing amount of green. It's a big city. It's a very populous city. A lot of buildings. But it's very easy to escape. And this is on the Wannsee, and the name of the palace is called Goethe-Institut. Goethe-Institut? Am I pronouncing it right? Anyway, that's mine. Yeah. Anyway, it's down lower west side of what was old West Berlin, kind of poking into Potsdam and East Berlin. There's a magnificent castle, and then you find a Maltese cross. I'm half Maltese, so I kind of took a picture of it. And Berlin, because of its connections to so many places, is very much like Toronto, in that you find kind of layers of people who came, or layers of Germans who went away and were influenced and came back to the place. And this is the I think, Goethe-Institut Bridge, which is made famous in Shawn Micallef's novel, where they exchange the spies between East and West. Say it? Glienicke, thank you, Glienicke Bridge. So it started, I think it's called The Smiley People, one of John le Carré's novels. Anyway, they did the transfer there until like 1986. So Toronto, we're not as good as telling our own stories, so you don't walk through the place and know that's where that happened, know where that's happened, because we've been quieter about our history, whereas Berlin, you just it's like, oh, that's where that happened, and that's where that happened. And kind of you come back here, it's like you need to encourage people in Toronto to tell stories more. Someone still leaves flowers at the bust of Karl Marx on Karl Marx Alley in East Berlin. I discovered this around 2 in the morning one day. And then you get these kind of wonderful, and this reminds me of Toronto, these East Berlin, this was the showcase of East Berlin apartment living. These kind of great, this put the big C in commie blocks. So when people say you live in a commie block somewhere in Toronto, this is the commie blocks. And they're really gorgeous apartments, lots of glass. And I think I would probably want to live in one of these if I lived in Berlin. I think about flaneuring, you don't necessarily have to walk. I think it's more about the exploring and the discovery. So I rented one of these Beast bikes and rode it to Tempelhof, the abandoned airport in the center of Berlin. And while I was riding out there, something you would not find in Toronto was this fellow. He pedaled his bike out, and it was a coffee bike, and it was the best Americano I drank in Berlin in my week of being there. I don't know how he got that stuff heated, but it was hot, and it was great, and you pay an extra 50 cents for a cup, and then you bring the cup back, so there's no litter. It's a deposit for the paper cup. And he said it's heavy, but he pedals his way onto the runway of Tempelhof, and then pedals away. And when we do stuff, like we just had this excruciating fight in Toronto about food trucks, and there's still food trucks, they're these big trucks, and you go to Berlin and you can find coffee on the bike. It's like, we don't have the ability to go small, it seems anymore. You have to go big North American. This is a family outside of Tempelhof I found on one of the great mixed up sidewalks. But they had this like wheelbarrow full of kids. And they were trying to call the other kids in. And it was just a great family. I think like the kids, and it felt like the friends of friends. It was like a birthday party. And you can just imagine like you taking your kid over in the Junction or in Cabbage Town, and that parent wheelbarrows your kid out to the party, but it looked like the most grand fun. And then this is in Volkspark, riding away from Tempelhof to Kreuzberg, people in the park drinking beer. They should also get a ticket like that. Another wonderful kids playland, this is called the Kids Platz, which is a great name for a kids playground. And the amount of culture you find in the city, and you can really read Berlin. You can go to Berlin, and in Toronto it's very much like this, in that we have a lot of postering, and we're very loose with putting stuff up on. Other cities are a little cleaner. So a messy city like Berlin and like Toronto, which isn't always the most beautiful thing, and a lot of people don't like the kind of scrappiness of it, but you can walk through this city and read it, and kind of get a sense of the culture and what's going on. And a city that's too clean, that kind of will power spray this off, you don't get to see stuff. And then so you're going for that, and then another kind of plummet into despair when you find all over Berlin are these little plaques that you just stumble upon, literally, and it lists the people that were taken from that site, and then where they were taken, generally which concentration camp, Auschwitz at the top right, and sometimes mostly when they died. And so you're in this kind of hustle and bustle of the place, and fun. Just before I saw this, a group of mimes, like 10 mimes, were like climbing around the Berlin street, and they had a boombox playing mime music, and just they kind of came up and engaged with people, and they kind of drifted off, and so mimes came by, and then stumbled upon this, so up and down in Berlin, and then you're back up with this glorious thing, maybe the only thing that can compete with the CN Tower is the communist TV tower. Sidewalk cafes that don't have fences. I mean, it's very shocking. I don't know how these people with beer walking by, or the neighbors feel safe when there's people with beers and drinks. And people on the sidewalk could walk right up to them and talk to them, without a fence in between them. So I think it's going to go bad soon. There'll be an incident. And then like another glory, the Bauhaus archive. Just stumbled upon it in West Berlin, just before Potsdamer Platz, which a lot of people hate, but a lot of people like because they're all there. It's like Dundas Square a little bit. All the chattering classes hate it. They think it's concrete. They think it's ugly. Yet you go there really right now, Friday night, it'll be packed with people. People gravitate to it. People seem to gravitate to Potsdamer Platz. So I think there's a connection between these spots that the kind of intelligentsia, chattering classes don't like, but everyone else likes, and they don't have these hang-ups about it. Wonderful shell house just before that. Good architecture. Then you find the wall. Another marking of the wall. These great bricks that go through the city. I'll just try to wrap up. And that's it. So I think as much as Berlin is a city that kind of makes me feel a little bit down about Toronto, I think there's parallels between the cities, and some potential, I think, for Toronto to if we could loosen up for a few things, to be a little bit more Berlin. So I went way too long for these. So I'll turn it over to Kisha.
Yep. Well, for me, despite being born and raised in Toronto, my kind of experiences with walking really started actually in Alberta. And they started with this strange idea that I had to walk with this fellow named Carl Bushby, who is a former RAF pilot and soldier, who decided about 12 years ago that he was going to circumnavigate the globe only on foot, starting in thank you, Shawn, there he is. Starting in Tierra del Fuego, all the way back to his hometown in England. And I had read about him. I was running an adventure travel magazine at the time, and said, yeah, why don't I go hang out with him for a few days? So the idea was to walk, you can stop that because that's later on. Go back to the first one, I think. You can't see my red.
Maybe I'll let you click on your
No, just go back to the first one where you can sort of see the mountains. Perfect. Yeah, so the idea was to actually walk along the Trans-Canada Highway between Banff and Jasper. The idea that it was about 320 kilometers and would take about 10 days. 30 days later, we rolled into Jasper. But that was a trip that really got me started thinking about walking and what walking meant. Because one of the reasons why Carl was on his expedition was because he had actually failed a number of tests in the military that would allow him to sort of advance, right? And so he was kind of doing it for this idea of redemption, in a sense. Like he was really sort of embarking on this trip, which was supposed to take him about 10 years, which is now, I believe he's on year 11. And it was really a way for him to sort of redeem himself and to prove something. And when I had set out on this trip, I just thought, well, this will be a great thing to do for a few days, right? 10 days, allegedly. But as it stretched longer, I sort of realized that at that time, I was actually going through a breakup of like almost a 10-year relationship, as well as giving up my business. And so this walk sort of became a way for me to sort of figure out what I was going to do with my life and sort of redeem what I had sort of considered my past mistakes. So we ended up on this kind of strange parallel journey. And that's when I kind of became familiar with the phrase solvitar ambulando, which essentially means it is solved by walking. And so it became this kind of interesting cross trip. And so when I came back to Toronto, my entire perspective on walking had changed because I had never treated the city as a place to walk in. And like most urban dwellers, we have to actually take a drive to walk someplace, technically, if you're talking about like walking in nature. So when I had come back to Toronto, my ride from Pearson was late, and it didn't even occur to me to not just walk home. They ended up showing up and I didn't, but I had just gotten so used to sort of being somebody who was able enough to walk absolutely anywhere after being on the road for 30 days that it didn't even occur to me that it would be a strange thing to do. And then when I got back too, soon after I moved out to the beaches, and this kind of compulsion to keep walking was really, really strong. And so it became something that I did on a regular basis. It almost became this kind of a soul cleansing experience, I would say. And the actual beach is obviously ideal for walking because there's a perfect path there, even though it's not always in great repair. But then it sort of soon dawned on me too, as I kind of expanded my walk from the actual beach into the streets, and I like to do it at night particularly, that there was this element of unsafeness to it. And I would talk to a lot of friends and they would say, well, you just can't go walking by yourself at night. And I said, well, it's a relatively safe area. And the question was oftentimes, well, what if something happened? And I began to think, well, the idea that I'm the person on the walk and putting myself in jeopardy doesn't really make sense. Whereas, we should ask the question, why am I in jeopardy if I choose to do something that is so natural and so basic and so important to me in terms of like I said, my own kind of soul cleansing. So, and then shortly after that, I ended up moving back downtown. And this was actually a real culture shock for me because my walks ended. Walking from a neighborhood place and suddenly being propelled into living at essentially Queen and McCall, I started to walk less. And I found myself actually changing in terms of like how I thought about things because I couldn't go for these sort of nightly soul cleansing walks. And then I decided, okay, well, what you have to start doing is start engaging with the city and those walks in a completely different way than you had before. So they sort of turned from solo, introverted walks into almost like the kind of walking that you do a lot, which is like really engaging with people. So, and then that kind of started me on this whole idea of like, well, what does walking mean, and what does walking mean as human beings? How do we not just forge ourselves, but how do we actually forge our place in the city as walkers? And so I actually started reading up on a lot of epic walks that had been done. There's obviously Mao's Long March, which everybody is familiar with. There's a fellow by the name of Slavomir Ruiz who actually escaped from the Gulag in 1941 and walked 4,000 miles to India, really because he actually had no choice. There's actually a walk going on right now called Out of Eden, and it's a walk from Ethiopia to Terra del Fuego. It's actually tracing human migration patterns that took place over centuries and centuries. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to do a bush bee. I'm going to come out and do come up with some epically wonderful long walk, right? And then as I sort of got a job and realized that was a little bit not necessarily possible right away, I started to sort of rethink how I walked in the city. And again, too, going from a very neighborhood place where walking was quite easy to downtown, like I said, really changed things. So I started to look at the city and my walking as a way of trying to actually escape the city by walking. And so I started to pretend that streets were labyrinths. And I started using track and field areas as ways of kind of walking meditation. And once I started to do that, I started to read a lot about the fact that not just the history of human walking, but that a lot of us actually walk wrong, because our walking is something that we're socialized in terms of how to do, but that the actual mechanics of walking not only vary from person to person, but they actually vary from culture to culture. And a lot of us, you know, are habitual in terms of how we walk, but that those walks are easy to change. And so one of the things I started doing was walking differently. So I would walk from the knees, or I would walk from my hips, or I would actually sometimes do one of those John Cleese Ministry of Funny walks if nobody was looking. And so what I started to do was just really try and sort of change the way I walked as a way of changing the way that I engaged in the city as well. So kind of a sort of a strange little sort of human experiment as well. And then one of the things that sort of came out of that was just the idea too that I needed to reestablish the way that I was not just walking in terms of the neighborhoods, but how I was interacting with people. And so one of the things I started to do was sort of take that mindset of, okay, I'm using the walks as a way of escaping the city, to more of a way of engaging the city. Because one of the things I found was that on these walks, particularly at night, particularly during the summer, when there was a little bit more street life, you would end up engaging with people and you would hear their stories. And so I started to realize that despite living in this city and living downtown all my life, there was this sense of cut-offness because I wasn't engaged in sort of with people, that kind of randomness interactions that you get on a sidewalk. And that started me thinking that walking is something that really, really, really equals community. One of the things they say is that, you know, without our ability to walk, humans wouldn't have developed speech, and speech is communication, and communication equals community. And so one of the things I started to realize was that despite living in this city for so long, it was really the physical act of walking around its streets that really made me engage with it a lot more. And I think that when you look at things like Jane's walks and whatnot, that walking can really be a sort of conduit for social change as well. Because when we're engaged with the city, when we're engaged with those people in the city, when we're actually engaged in sort of street walking life, we tend to care a lot more about the city and tend to care a lot more about the people. And when you do that, I think you've got a community and anything is possible. I think I'm forgetting some of the things I was going to say, but that was basically it. Oh, one of the things here, actually, you want to fast forward. One more. I started to get really obsessed with watching other people walk. And like, I know that, you know, I have friends who I can see from 2 blocks away, I can recognize their walks. And so I just really started taking a lot of pictures of people walking and watching people walking. And one of the things I found too was that I lived in Japan for a year, in Osaka, Japan. And one of the things that you were talking about in terms of, like, you know, those horrible couples holding hands on the streets and whatnot, right? When I came back from, like, when you're in Japan, it's such a massive city. And it's actually a very walkable city in many ways. But one of the most difficult things getting used to there was walking on crowded sidewalks. Because it's suddenly, you sort of have to pretend like, you know, those Tour de France riders who are in the peloton, and you're like, how can they all be going the exact same speed and not hitting each other? Almost like schools of fishes, right? And you really sort of start to learn that. And once you sort of get engaged in that, it's quite amazing because it's sort of this energy that takes you along. But in Toronto, it was incredibly ungraceful. And, you know, especially slow walkers, people who walk slowly, which I think is wonderful, but also because in Toronto, it's so much more about trying to get from point A to point B, whereas, you know, oftentimes, again too, when I came back, the idea of walking for a walk's sake is oftentimes treated as something quite freakish, right? And I think it's even more difficult if you are a woman and you are walking by yourself, whether it's in a safe neighborhood or not. There's always a sense of exposure. There's always a sense of, well, you know, again, what if something happens to you? But anyway, so I became slightly obsessed with watching people walk. And one of the things I did too was I would match people's footsteps, especially in sort of like anywhere where there was a noise. And it was amazing to watch people's reactions to it, because it was like, you know, even if you're making noise behind them, it doesn't sort of register. But when you start matching people's footsteps, it becomes this strange, like, invasion of privacy. And I had people quite, you know, I don't do this much anymore, you know, but, I'm still trying to figure this out. I would love people's perspectives on why this is so, like, upsetting, right? So yeah, actually there's just a few pictures of just people, Shawn, if you will. I just like photographing people walking. And I've probably got 200 or something of them. That's the beach. That was the gates in New York, yeah. And that's the other thing too, is that, you know, Toronto, I mean, ask any New Yorker what their best part, well, what their favorite part of New York is, and they say it's a great walking city. And I think National Geographic said, you know, name Toronto one of the top 10 walking cities as well. So, and again too, it doesn't have beautiful wide boulevards and whatnot, and there isn't as much of a street culture, but you can certainly get around. And so one of the things that I've actually been experimenting with the last few months is the idea of walking as just purely transportation. Now I work in Agincourt, so walking to work is not an option. But years ago, I had two friends who walked back and forth to work every day, and their journeys took between 60 and 90 minutes. And I just thought, like, that's ridiculous. Like, why would you spend that much time walking? And walking as transport, as opposed to walking for exercise, or as opposed to walking because your car is broken, or, you know, your bike has a flat. And so, and it's kind of, you know, my sort of latest social experiment, or personal social experiment, and it's proving quite difficult, to be honest. So, not because Toronto's not a hard city to walk in, but the logistics of actually transporting yourself around, as opposed to having a 1,000-pound car do it for you, are actually quite tricky.
It's a big city.
Yeah. But my two best friends in the world moved to LA, and if you ask them what they miss most, the first thing they say is walking. Yeah.
That's a great song. Nobody walks in LA.
Is there a song that,
Yeah,
well, you
new wave
can.
band. New
Yeah.
wave band from the 80s.
Well, you actually can, so there you go. Well, they also miss winter, which makes no sense at all. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, just a few shots of people.
Does anyone ever turn around and like confront you when you're like, you know, stalking them?
When I'm stalking them, yes, I've had quite a people, and I just usually just kind of go. People just sort of like look around and go like, "What's that strange noise?" Right? And I don't know if it's because they're not aware of their footsteps, or because I'm making them aware of their footsteps, or I'm still kind of curious as to why it causes such a visceral reaction.
Cloning.
Is that TV show?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
You mentioned a bit about, you know, places you're not supposed to walk, and people are surprised that you walk. But you seem kind of fearless in that you will go out and walk, even though you feel exposed. How do you negotiate that real legitimate fear? If you were on Twitter over the last week, or since Friday, since that shooting in California, there's been a hashtag called Yes All Women, which women share their experiences in all manner of life, but a lot of them are about walking down the street being harassed. Places I walk around, you know, just down any sidewalk, day or night, and never experienced this. And the amount of stories I saw of people I knew and other people who just got retweeted in, it's just overwhelming amount of, you know, street harassment, and like you. And people who were kind of almost like beaten back out of the streets, out of walking, because of the crap and danger that they had to go through. So how do you negotiate that very real threats?
Well, the interesting thing too is like living in the beaches too, and being on the beach would be considered sort of a safer neighborhood than, let's say, walking around Chinatown at 2 o'clock in the morning. But I felt safer walking around Chinatown at 2 o'clock in the morning, even though, you know, there might be a little bit, I didn't really experience a lot of harassment, but it actually felt safer simply because there was more people around. And if I ever was in trouble, I remember too, living in the suburbs for a time, and, you know, waiting at a bus stop in the middle of winter right? And feeling, the suburbs are supposed to be safe, there's all these houses there, but I felt scared because there wasn't anybody around. So there's a certain safety, not necessarily safety numbers, but there was a certain comfortability that I had walking like right downtown as opposed to walking on a quiet neighborly street. And so, but in terms of, I would always approach it with the idea that, I shouldn't be questioned because I'm choosing to walk, right? We should question why someone's choosing to attack me and why I should be responsible for somebody else's actions, which I didn't really think is fair, in terms of the questions about, walking alone by yourself, so, yeah.
The few times I've ever felt that, and I have, as a white male, I have the most liberty, unfortunately, of anyone, but the only time I ever feel that kind of creep of fear is when I go back to Windsor, and when I go back to Windsor, because I go often, Mom still lives there, etc. I made an effort to walk around Windsor, the city I thought I knew really well, but now I realize I knew it from a car. So I'm going back and walking a lot more. But it's still a car city, so I'm often the only person out on the road.
And do you find people look at you strangely because
Yes.
they're like, why are you walking?
So you stick out,
Like you're
right?
driving?
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm not always dressed like this. You're nondescript. Just being
Yeah.
a pedestrian out there
Mhm.
makes you visit. Like when I was there just at Easter, or I guess last month, walking down one of the main strips between the university and downtown, which is about 3 kilometers apart. Kind of a big avenue. But I wasn't the only one. And a car slows down next to me, and this bro yells out, take off the hat. I was wearing a hat, and I just stopped and looked at him, and he and his pals in the car just looked at me, and he just yelled, and then he yelled again, take off the hat, bitch. And I just looked at him, and I just turned away and started walking, and then with that, like, your eyeball kind of sticks out and looks around you, has that ability at these moments, and then like the car just slowly went away. It never
Right.
happens in Toronto because there's too many people around. So and Jane Jacobs had a great line, the urban thinker, eyes on the street. When there's people out, when you have this not even a critical mass, you just need a few a collection of strangers around, rather than just like a group of dudes or something. But a collection of people around, it just kind of, all those people sort of, the strangers kind of equalize it a little bit. Whereas in Windsor or Kelowna, BC, one of the other places I've ever felt this feeling, that wasn't there. No offense to BC. Maybe if you want to share some of their experiences with walking either in Toronto or anywhere, or what some of the I don't know, the limitations you found in exploring the city.
I'm interested in dogs. You showed lots of pictures of Berlin, and I don't recall seeing any dogs. I'm just wondering what dogs do to walking culture. Is
Do you know-
it good
sorry.
or bad?
Do you know what they do? They legitimize it. Because again, it's this idea
You're walking
that
your dog,
a
so you
walk
use
for
them.
a walk's sake is just like, well, why are you walking, right?
Right.
But when you have a dog, and this is obviously in the beaches, right? Everybody has a baby and a dog in the beaches, so. And I keep pointing to my mom who lives in the beaches, so, and that's who I was living with when I was there, so.
And I have a dog.
And who now has a dog. But that's the idea too, is that, dogs legitimize walking. They give people an excuse to walk, right? Whereas, oftentimes walking in the beach, I would be the only person out who didn't have a dog, right? And so just be like, what are you doing, kind of thing. So, and especially if you're alone too, because even though, you have this wonderful boardwalk, I would say that it was 70% couples and families. There was often very few times when you would just sort of see one person ambulating along. And so, yeah, dogs definitely legitimize walking, for sure. Yeah, and I think it's also a lot of times too that dogs can also be a safety issue as well. So if you have a big dog, maybe, as a male or a female, somebody won't mess with you, as opposed to just being alone.
I did come across a lot of dogs, and I just didn't take pictures of them. But it's a good dog city, and so many people live in apartments, and so there's no backyard, so there are a lot of people with them out on the street. I have a dog, a mid-sized poodle, this big or so. And we go for epic walks. He's very good at walking. He can go for 10 kilometers and just keep going and keep pulling. And when I'm with him, I kind of like going with him because I sometimes let him decide where we're going, if we're just going out for a walk. It's this funny thing when I'm in a hurry and he does, when he doesn't realize that it's not one of those walks where we just have to go around the block because I have to do something and the guilt hits. But we have this impasse once in a while where, because I'm used to letting him, take me around, and where he goes, it's a really good psychogeographic tool. A poodle. Just like follow. But then we have this impasse where I'm like, we're going, and he just looks at me like in this kind of like, like in this shock, right? But they're great for drifting, but also that I will be out at 2 in the morning sometimes, just kind of slowly walking down Jarvis Street, so up around Jarvis and Bloor, which if I didn't have the poodle, I would be this creepy guy, just slowly, you get this view of the city, which is kind of cool, really slow, it's like kind of micro view, but I'm not a creep because I have.
Well, Carl Bushby actually was going to, at several points, actually have a dog with him, but because dogs' feet are, I forget all of the sort of details or whatnot, but it just would have been too hard to actually have a dog on the road with him, but one of the reasons why he wanted to was not just companionship, was because it helped legitimize him going into an area. Because of course the question was, why are you walking? And everybody assumed, well, maybe he's walking for a cause or whatnot, because there are so many walks for causes, right? These days. And so he was oftentimes sort of treated like a weirdo because he's doing this walk, and then once people sort of found out, wow, this is a pretty epic walk and he's a pretty interesting guy, they would sort of welcome him in. But the initial thing was, why are you walking, right? And especially when we were on the Trans-Canada Highway, which is just, which is motorhome after motorhome. I mean, we were walking, you always walk into traffic. The number of times, people threw stuff at us, people called us freaks, people would swerve their cars and try and bump us off the road, and a lot of people would stop and say, what are you doing, right? And a lot of people were great and they would stop and give us food and take pictures and all that kind of stuff too, but it was just this constant puzzlement, like, what are you doing? Like, why are you doing this kind of thing? So those questions never ended.
When you walk with the dog here, you are limited to where you go, you have to stay outside, generally. There's a few buildings where you can bring your dog in. Manulife Center is pretty cool about that because they have a residence in there, so you do see dogs indoors. But otherwise, you don't. And when I've walked with my friends in London and UK, and they have a nice dash hound, if we feel like going for a beer, we can go into the bar with the dog. So it's a funny, you're limited to the outdoors when you have a dog here, which is unlike some European places.
Yeah, thanks for these wonderful remarks. Something that I like about Toronto, or have liked about Toronto, is what I think of as its sonic dynamics, that there are pockets of noise and then pockets of relative calm or even silence. And it's nice to have, that's something that I haven't found about Manhattan, for instance. The noise level seems to be fairly constant and fairly wearing. And that's something, I lived in Berlin for a couple of years in the 90s, and I found the same kind of dynamics there. I had a toddler at the time, and I would pick her up from her daycare in the early afternoon after daycare was finished, and put her in her stroller and go for a walk. And we would walk about 10 kilometers a day. It was wonderful. And she would sit in her stroller and eat her snack, and I would look at things, and we would talk. And we would go through these pockets of streets in Schöneberg and Kreuzberg, and that were relatively quiet, these big tenements and narrow streets and so on. And she would be chatting and noticing things and sort of be stimulated by the individual sounds that she got from the street. And then we would head up Potsdamerplatz and into Potsdamerplatz, which at the time was the busiest construction site in Europe, if not the world, with 60 cranes going and an incredible din. And she would, like clockwork, every day fall asleep as we had Potsdamerplatz, because the noise was overstimulating or perhaps simply deadening. Mm-hmm. And it made me sort of realize that this counterintuitive thing about the quiet parts of the city are the places where you can be stimulated by stuff, and the noise, the deadening noise, doesn't stimulate you; just kind of puts you to sleep.
Yeah. And as city people, we kind of, the white noise just becomes almost no noise, just there.
I did an audio art workshop at the AGO, and one of the things that we did was actually, as a group, went out for a walk and just listened. So there was about 8 or 9 of us, and the idea was to just listen. We didn't record anything at that point, but it was a real almost shock to sort of, when you really sort of, when you're walking and you're paying attention to nothing but noise, it just, the city turns into a different place. And one of the things we did the next workshop was actually walk with our eyes closed while somebody else from the group would be holding us. And that was one of the most terrifying things. It was really, really terrifying. I mean, most of us were just sort of coupled, but there were some people who needed 2 people because it was so disconcerting. But then once you sort of relax into it and you start to hear sounds, you start to hear like all of these amazing layers of sounds. And if you really concentrate, you can sort of hear people, and you can hear little bits of music, and you can hear an argument that's going on like, half a block away. So, the idea of just, walking around a city with your eyes completely shut, it brings everything internal, and actually kind of, walking is something that can be, a very kind of intellectual or internal exercise. But when you do it with your eyes closed, it's like, it just amplifies that by 10 times. So it's quite an amazing experience and terrifying. And especially because we were actually at between like Queen and Bathurst, and we walked, and it was, it was like a Thursday night. So it wasn't quiet daylight time, that's for sure. Yeah.
If you're into walking, you're here. One of the sorry,
Let's talk about brunch.
it's actually not done yet. There's a fantastic book by Rebecca Solnit called Wanderlust, which she published in 2000. She's from San Francisco. A great public intellectual of the West Coast, and she wrote Wanderlust, and then I read it just as I was getting into Toronto. So it was also an influencing bit. But she talks a lot about the history of walking and how walking is used in protest, walking is used in labyrinths. And then
she also talks a lot about women and walking, and how different that is, and the idea that, again, why are we being questioned for walking as opposed to, be questioning why other people would want to attack us for walking. Yeah.
So I think it's still in print, and anyway, so it is the best book I've ever read on walking.
Who's the last?
Wanderlust, Rebecca Solnit, Solnit.
And the interesting thing too is along the bottom is just a great collection of walking quotes, which are also really, really fun. So, yeah.
There's a lot of areas in Toronto that don't, to my mind, aren't conducive to this kind of walking and drifting, or just walking for the sake of walking. I'm thinking of certain areas of the suburbs.
Places without sidewalks.
Yeah. I know the Jane walks have tried to address some of that, with taking the walks to those places and, trying to figure out what it is about those places and making them more amenable to walking. But there's a lot of Toronto that's not very kind to the idea of walking. The downtown where we live is great. We can walk where we want to walk. We don't need to have a car and all that. We're very privileged, I think, us living in downtown, but when you're further out, it's
But even some of these like new downtown condo developments as well, like especially the ones by the Gardner, they're building these massive buildings that are supposed to be housing thousands of people, but there's no sidewalks.
Yeah, that's true.
Like you drive along the Gardner and you see all of these people because they're building all of these condos, and it's like, I mean, it's kind of interesting and whatnot, but it's really not conducive to walking at all.
It's still the thin Toronto sidewalk.
Yeah, they're thin Toronto sidewalks, and I know those condo developments right around the Sky Dome, because I used to work at the CBC, and I would sort of go, I would try and go for a walk on my lunch hour around there. It's like, there's, 5 new condo buildings, and there's nowhere to walk. There's no public space, right? Which I find, it doesn't make any sense to me at all. It's like the buildings, unlike, one of the great things about Barcelona is that it's an amazing walking city. But also one of the things that they do is that they try and build buildings back from the sidewalks. And one of the things I love about the city is you know, you can have a road like this, but the actual building faces this, so that you actually have a triangle. You know, the buildings aren't built right to the corner. And yet in Toronto, everything is built to, you know, it doesn't take that much space. You know, give it a meter, give it a couple of meters, you know, it's like it doesn't take that much space, but I find with a lot of these new developments, the sidewalks are even shrinking so that couples won't be able to walk hand in hand. They're gonna have to walk behind each other to get anywhere.
Yes.
So.
I like walking in the suburbs because I find it incredibly interesting, more interesting sometimes than walking downtown in what's going on in the strip malls especially. But you mentioned the word privilege. Downtown is privileged because, you know, it's built a little more walkable, whereas the suburbs, so much of Toronto, so much of Canada, a lot of Toronto, I think most of Toronto was built after the war when the car was the prime mover in urban design. So you get these very hostile environments that a lot of people live who are new Canadians, lower income, who don't have cars. So and I think a lot of the Jane Walks are activism driven in that it's kind of shining a light on people who are treating hostile automotive areas as pedestrian by necessity. So you go there and you're never alone on the sidewalk in a lot of these, you know, places along Eglinton or Lawrence in Scarborough, you know, or Rexdale Road or Dixon Road in Rock Fordland, because there's lots of people who don't have any other choice. So they're out on the street. So it is you do get a sense of the crowd and people watching as you would down here. But the landscape tends to be kind of ugly. You're on 8 lane wide arterials. So that's the biggest challenge one of the biggest challenges in Toronto is how to adapt. Not downtown. Downtown's going to be fine. You know, it's going to be crowded as good cities are. But the suburbs, how do we adapt those landscapes to a walkable? So like making where a car kind of has those kind of curves that are like lets a car race around, making them more of a 90-degree angle, so the car has to slow down and make a conscious turn, so it's not like an off-ramp. There's so many people who just cross their neighborhood corner and it's an off-ramp, rather than, you know, like Lawrence and Brimley and those kind of big intersections, kind of acidifying. There was a woman in the back, and then you. And I think we probably have like 10 more minutes? 5 more minutes? Okay.
So I guess the one thing that I was thinking about listening to this, so, you know, I live downtown. I made a conscious decision not to own a car. Probably not because I love to walk, just because I'm cheap or something. It just seemed like a good financial thing. But a lot of it is about urban design. So you look at a city like Berlin, what's interesting about the architecture, a lot of, you know, they actually have fairly restrictive zoning laws about density of housing, quality of buildings, etc., and yet have incredibly interesting architecture. And so we have this idea here that you can't do that. You know, we've just set the rules, but a lot of it is not seeing the city from the perspective of just the walker, or just the cyclist, or just the motors, you know, the car. We tend not to think of all of them, and I think probably the best people are the people that do all three regularly and realize the implications of the different decisions. When you only do one, you start to forget, wow, if I do this, I've impeded the cyclists or the drivers, and I think that's often where we get stuck here.
Well, and that's why, you know, with all of these new condo developments, we actually have a chance to sort of change that, right? Like we actually have a chance, or in many cases had a chance to actually build, you know, ways for people to move around. But a lot of times, it would be, like even looking at a place like Liberty Village, right? Half of it's parking lots. All of the shops, you know, in front of all of the shops are parking lots. There's no benches there, you know, and again, the sidewalks are just sort of meant for one person. So, you know, we had the chance to do this, and we're blowing it. Whereas in Europe, I can't think of some of the exact cities, but they're you know, a lot of these new developments, whether they're apartment buildings or kind of townhouse or just sort of residential areas, you know, the mandate is make them walkable, right? And we just don't seem to be able to do that in Toronto. It's not a focus.
We look at where the political arguments are. It's all about it's so retrograde. My theory of Toronto is that we are a teenage city, and we're still the kind of on top, the city still thinks of itself as a Midwestern city, not an East Coast city. We are Indianapolis, and you can drive anywhere and get to the park there. And somewhere that's deep in the core of Toronto, we have not yet had this kind of conversion into adulthood the way, say, Berlin did. And Berlin became an adult long before there were cars. So Toronto, because it's newer, suffers from that. It's hard to let go of that, I think. So that's why we see these fights all the time. It's like puberty, city puberty that we're going through. And that's why
It's a good way to describe it.
the only way that will change is with political, with political will, and that just takes kind of a critical mass of people behind it. So I think we have
And
like,
marching is a really good way to do that, as history has shown. So, and again too, I think the Jane's walks are a great example of that too, because they're really about they're about physical civic engagement a lot of times too. So
maybe the last question is on the fellow in the back, and then I think we have to wrap up.
So I see walking in Toronto through a really different lens. I'm from Newfoundland. I spent half my life growing up in an Elfin community. And there was kind of in a kind of fishing village, 300 people. And there was this figurehead, like Cyril, the retired fisherman who would walk maybe 10 hours a day. And he would walk, he'd be kind of like you, walking from Pearson, right? But he would do that as his ritual. There would be a constellation of villages around, and part of the role that he had was moving through the constellation, bringing news around, and it was all founded on this notion that it's okay to drop in.
yeah.
And in Toronto, there is an unwritten, written, I don't know, maybe you all get inoculated against it, but there's a kind of a prohibition against dropping in on people. And it's really interesting because at home it's kind of intergenerational in this community. There was this old guy, but then there was like this younger guy, and from the time he was like 13, he would just be out and he would walk and he would walk, and it was his kind of role, kind of carrying this on. So when I moved from that kind of environment and came here, experience like Paul Bushby kind of makes sense to me. And Shawn, you kind of makes sense to me in that kind of living commitment to being a walker. And people do it in malls, people do it in ugly places. I'm just wondering, is there like something that's not a political movement, but it's about dropping in? That is kind of missing in terms of the mix of what will actually motivate people to think that it's important.
I remember when I was growing up in high school, and this is of course before cell phones, right? We would always just drop in. You would never even, call if you left the house. You'd be out doing something and you would constantly drop in. So, but it doesn't seem to be something that people do anymore. And I don't know if that's the advent of cell phones. I don't know if that's a thing that kids do and adults don't do, but yeah, it's pretty interesting. That's a really interesting.
Maybe the equivalent now, because actually the thought of dropping in, it just makes me feel a little queasy.
Yeah. Why is that? Why is that?
I need a text or two.
Yeah.
Half an hour at least. But maybe now with Twitter, if you're on Twitter, I've had kind of serendipitous meetings with people I noticed were tweeting from near me, and I tweeted at them, "Hey, we're near, Yonge and Queen or whatever," and I've kind of dropped in public on people because of electronic connections. So maybe that's because we can't. The culture of your house is not Newfoundland.
But I think the thing is that then you miss what the constellation of the
Yeah.
is, right? And that it seems like that's often something that's missing for people in terms of the motivation for walking. It's kind of like being called Bushby, but in like a 5-mile radius of where you live.
I think people are more prone to drop in on people when they're sitting on the front porch.
Yeah.
So if you have that kind of a community,
And as
and you see them, like, you don't want to knock on their door, but if you see them sitting there, then you want to.
Buzz them from the concierge's desk.
as Kisha mentioned, if you live in apartments, your stoop is the bench. The benches up front, and Toronto's not good at putting benches and making nice public realm, so. Better public realm, maybe we'll have the constellation.
But when you walk on public streets or, like in residential areas, especially during the summer and people are, just sitting on their porch and the minute you say, hey, having a good evening, you stop and you talk, right? So again, too, it's that, it's just that idea about life on the streets and being outside, and places that are actually conducive to that.
And it's that kind of evening, so maybe we should go out.
Yeah.
and after this winter that we've had, so.
Yes.
Maybe that's, thanks to the Goethe-Institut for letting us talk about walking for
Yeah.
an hour.